Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It was a question that had been bothering me for a while now. Why did I always feel like something was wrong when I went for my evening walks? It wasn't the quietness of the streets, nor the way the shadows stretched across the sidewalks like living things. It wasn't the stillness of the air either that seemed to press against my skin. No, it was the smell. Every night, as I walked through the familiar streets, I noticed it. At first, it was faint, a subtle odor, almost like the earth after rain, yet something else mixed with it, something darker. I couldn't place it. I wondered if it was the scent of decay, of something old and forgotten, just barely stirring in the cool evening breeze. The city was always quiet in the evenings, the hum of daily life dimming as the hours grew later. Only the faint rustling of leaves or the occasional distant car made any noise. But every evening, the smell grew more noticeable. Each night, I found myself taking a longer route just to avoid it, but somehow, it always found me. It was always strongest near the old park at the edge of town, where the trees crowded together like silent watchers. I had walked by it countless times before, but now it felt different. The branches above me creaked in the wind, and the leaves crunched underfoot, but it wasn't the usual sounds. It was something else, something too deliberate. Almost as though something was watching me from within the trees, waiting for me to step closer. I had tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild. But there it was, the unmistakable smell, creeping into my senses more insistently with every passing night. It wasn't just the dampness of the earth or the scent of the night air. It smelled wrong, as if something had been left to rot just out of sight, lingering long past its time. One evening, I decided to confront it. Maybe I could trace the source, find out what was causing that unsettling smell. The sun had dipped low, and the streetlights cast long, slanted shadows along the pavement. The breeze was chilly, whispering through the trees as I walked towards the park. The air seemed to thicken as I neared the entrance, and the scent grew stronger, more pungent. I stopped at the gate, looking in. It was dark beyond, the path winding through the trees toward the small, forgotten pond at the center of the park. The smell was coming from there, I was sure of it. But I couldn't see anything. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped through the gate, the dry leaves crumbling under my shoes. I moved slowly, the sound of my footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. The scent was suffocating now, wrapping itself around my senses, making my head spin. The air seemed too thick, too heavy. I rounded a bend, my breath catching in my throat. I could just make out the shape of the pond in the distance, the water still and black, reflecting the dark sky. But it was the other shapes that caught my attention. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. Figures, dark and indistinct, moved around the edges of the water. The smell was coming from them, no doubt about it. I froze, unable to move. There was something terribly wrong with the scene before me. The figures weren't walking. They were dragging themselves along the ground, their movements jerky and unnatural. I wanted to turn and run, to escape the nightmare I was witnessing, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The smell grew stronger, thicker, more oppressive. It was a rotting stench, like flesh left to decay, and I could feel my stomach twist with the force of it. My heart raced in my chest, and every instinct screamed for me to flee. But my body refused to obey. I stood there, watching, as the figures began to take shape. They weren't human. I couldn't see their faces, but I could see the twisted shapes of their limbs, the way they contorted unnaturally as they crawled closer. The closer they got, the more intense the smell became, almost unbearable. Something inside me broke then, and I took a step backward, then another, then turned to run. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted away from the park, away from the figures, away from the smell. I didn't stop until I was back on familiar streets, my heart still pounding in my chest. But as I glanced over my shoulder, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were following me, that I hadn't escaped at all. The smell lingered in my nose, clinging to me like an invisible fog. I couldn't rid myself of it, no matter how hard I tried. And the worst part? I knew it wasn't over. I had barely begun to understand what I was dealing with. Something was out there. Something that would not let me go. The next few days passed in a haze, as if I were moving through someone else's life. I couldn't focus on anything, work, meals, even conversations. The smell was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, in every corner of my apartment, in every breath of air I took. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just a product of my imagination, a result of too many late-night walks and too little sleep. But then, it happened again. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the blinking cursor on my computer screen, trying to concentrate on the report I had to finish. The silence of my apartment was unbearable. I kept hearing that faint rustling sound, like something shifting just out of sight, like a whisper on the edge of hearing. It was coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the wind, pushing through the cracks in the window or the old floorboards creaking. But then I smelled it, the stench that had followed me since that night in the park. It was faint at first, a distant echo of decay, but it grew stronger as I sat frozen at my desk. My body tensed, my muscles stiffening, and I fought the urge to run, to escape to anywhere but this room. But where could I go? The sound of shuffling feet, almost imperceptible but unmistakable, came closer. Slowly, methodically, as though whoever, or whatever, was moving was taking its time. My heart raced, and I could feel the cold sweat prickle along my skin. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body screaming for me to move, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The smell was overwhelming now, filling the apartment like a suffocating fog. The figure in the hallway, just out of sight, seemed to grow larger with each passing second. I moved toward the door, hoping against hope that I could somehow escape. But before I could reach it, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and the lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And that smell, rotting, putrid, was all around me, closer now, as though the source of it had stepped right into my apartment. I turned to face it. The hallway was empty. But I knew something was there. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the presence of something unseen, something watching me, just beyond my reach. I could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and unblinking. My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and running down the hallway of my building, through the stairwell, and out into the street. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, but the smell lingered, clinging to me even in the cool night breeze. I couldn't shake it off. It followed me, no matter how far I ran. I had to go back to the park. Something in the back of my mind told me that I couldn't avoid it any longer. The figures, The smell, it was all connected, and if I didn't face it, I would never be free. But deep down, I knew. I wasn't just running from a smell or shadows in the night. I was running from something far darker, something that had already begun to claim me. The next evening, I stood at the edge of the park again, the air cold and crisp. The trees swayed gently, but there was no wind. The ground felt strangely solid underfoot, as though it had been waiting for me. The silence around me was oppressive, as though the world had held its breath. I had no choice. I stepped into the park. The smell hit me immediately, stronger than before. My stomach churned, and I nearly turned back, but something deeper inside me pushed me forward. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but as I moved closer to the pond, the figures returned. They were no longer crawling, they were standing, their forms twisted and unnatural in the dim light, their heads tilting as if they could sense my presence. I froze. My heart thudded painfully against my ribcage. The figures didn't move, but I could feel their eyes on me, their gaze burning into my skin, chilling me to the bone. And then, one of them stepped forward. It wasn't like the others. It didn't drag itself along the ground. No, this one stood upright, towering over me, its form unnervingly human in shape. But its face was obscured by shadows, an endless, impenetrable darkness that seemed to absorb the very light around it. The air grew thicker, the smell almost unbearable now, as if it was emanating from the creature itself. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure raised its arm, and with it, the darkness seemed to shift, as if something ancient and malevolent was stirring. The ground beneath me trembled, a low, vibrating hum that I could feel deep within my bones. And then, without warning, it spoke. The voice was not a voice at all. It was more like a thought, an invasion into my mind. Cold. Unyielding. You cannot escape. And just like that, I understood. Whatever this was, it had been waiting for me. It had always been there, just out of sight, just beyond my understanding. It was no longer a question of what I had to face. It was a question of whether I would survive what had already begun. I don't remember how I got home that night. One moment, I was standing in the park, trapped in the grip of the creature's presence, and the next, I was stumbling through the door of my apartment, breathless, heart racing, and drenched in sweat. The air still felt thick, as if the darkness had followed me back, hanging over my every step. The smell, it was everywhere. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion, anxiety, and unease. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's figure, the darkness where its face should have been, the chilling whisper that echoed in my mind, "You cannot escape." The words repeated themselves like an unsettling mantra, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I tried to go about my daily routine, but everything felt wrong. The city seemed quieter, the streets darker, the air thicker. I couldn't escape it. It had me. It wasn't just the fear of the creature anymore, or the way it seemed to haunt every corner of my life. It was the strange occurrences that started happening around me. The lights flickered in my apartment for no reason, shadows moving across walls where there should have been none. The sounds, soft whispers, indistinguishable voices, faint footsteps behind me when no one was there. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if something truly otherworldly was creeping into my reality. I tried to tell myself it was just the stress, just the fear. But deep down, I knew better. It was becoming harder to separate what was real from what was a twisted manifestation of my mind. That evening, I made up my mind. I couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in my own terror. I had to face it again. I had to go back to the park. I had to confront whatever it was that had latched onto me, and I had to end it once and for all. But I wasn't alone this time. When I arrived at the park, the air felt colder than before. The wind whispered through the trees, but it didn't feel natural. The shadows around me seemed deeper, stretching out like long, dark fingers reaching for me. As I stepped onto the familiar path leading toward the pond, I heard it again, the soft, scraping noise of something dragging across the ground. I wasn't imagining it this time. It was real. The creatures were here again, hidden in the dark, waiting for me. I moved forward cautiously, my breath shallow, my body tense. The smell, the stench of decay and rot, grew stronger, almost overpowering, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what was happening. I had to face it. And then I saw them. The figures were there, standing motionless in the distance. They were no longer crawling, now they stood as tall as men, their bodies warped and twisted in unnatural angles. Their faces, if you could even call them faces, were obscured by layers of shadow, an absence that made my stomach twist in dread. But I could still feel their eyes on me, even if I couldn't see them. Cold, unblinking eyes, watching, waiting. One of them took a step forward. My legs froze in place. I couldn't move. The world around me seemed to disappear, as though I were being swallowed by the very shadows that surrounded me. And then, that voice, cold, sharp, cutting through my thoughts once again. You cannot escape. The figure spoke, but the voice didn't come from it. It came from inside me, from somewhere deep in my soul. It was as if it had always been there, buried beneath layers of consciousness, waiting to break free. I couldn't breathe. The air had become thick with something dark, something ancient, something that didn't belong to this world. The shadows around me grew deeper, more oppressive. The figures moved closer, their bodies twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible, their steps slow and deliberate. Every movement, every shift in their posture sent a ripple of terror through me. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the darkness, a glimmer of something that didn't belong. But then it grew clearer, emerging from the depths of the pond. A shape, dark and formless, rising slowly from the water. The stench of decay was unbearable now, filling my nostrils, burning my throat. It was all-consuming. The figure rising from the pond was like nothing I had ever seen. Its shape was shifting, constantly changing, as though it were made of darkness itself. Its presence was suffocating, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. It was like a hole in the universe, a tear between worlds, pulling everything toward it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, locked in place by the sheer force of the creature's presence. And then, the whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just in my mind. It was around me, inside me, filling the air. You are ours. The shadows closed in on me, tightening around my chest like a vice. The darkness was swallowing everything, my breath, my thoughts, my very essence. I was no longer standing in the park. I was lost, consumed by the dark, bound to something that defied explanation, something that had been waiting for me all along. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't supposed to escape. I was never supposed to escape. I had become part of it. Part of the darkness. Part of the night. I woke up in my bed. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft light across the room. My hands trembled as I sat up, my head pounding with the remnants of a nightmare I couldn't fully remember. The darkness, the creatures, the voice. It all felt so real, so close, yet when I opened my eyes, it was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. It hadn't been just a dream. The air in my apartment felt too still, too quiet, as if something was waiting, holding its breath. I glanced around, half expecting the shadows to shift, the figures to emerge from the corners of the room. But nothing happened. There was no smell, no whisper of footsteps, no presence watching me. I told myself I was just imagining things, that I had been too scared, too overwhelmed the night before. But the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. Something had changed. I could feel it, like a weight pressing on my chest. That night, I ventured out again, against every instinct telling me to stay inside. I had to see for myself. I had to know if it was real or if I was losing my mind. The walk to the park felt different this time. The air was thick, oppressive, and every step I took echoed in my ears, louder than it should have been. The smell, it lingered, faint but unmistakable, still lingering from the night before. When I reached the park, everything was eerily silent. The trees stood like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the path. The pond, usually calm and serene, looked like a black mirror, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple. I moved toward the center of the park, toward the pond, where I knew the creatures had emerged. The stench of rock clung to the air, stronger than before, almost overwhelming. It took everything in me to keep walking, to keep moving forward. And then, I saw them. They were standing there, just as before, their figures no longer crawling, but fully formed, twisted and deformed by the dark forces that controlled them. They didn't move, didn't speak. But their presence was suffocating, pressing down on me like a physical weight. They were waiting for something. Waiting for me. But then, something was different. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't one of the distorted creatures. No! This one was taller, more humanoid, its movements deliberate, its form cloaked in darkness. Its presence was different from the others, more powerful, more commanding. It felt like the very embodiment of the night itself. I couldn't move. I was frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs unable to carry me away. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, to escape. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in front of me. It was so close now, standing just a few feet away. I could feel its coldness, the emptiness it radiated, a void that swallowed everything around it. The smell, the decay, was almost unbearable now, as though it was emanating from the very air itself. It raised a hand, and my body responded before my mind could catch up. I stumbled backward, but my feet wouldn't obey. I couldn't escape. I was trapped, caught in the gaze of this thing that wasn't human, wasn't even alive in the way I understood. And then, the voice came. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It wasn't just in my mind. It was everywhere. Inside me. Around me. The words echoed through my bones, reverberating in my chest like a deep, vibrating hum. You belong to the darkness now. The words were cold, final, suffocating. There was no escape, no way to fight it. The figure stepped closer, and with each step, the shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, until I couldn't tell where the figure ended and the night began. It was as if the darkness itself was swallowing me, pulling me into its depths. I reached out, desperate to break free, but my hands couldn't find purchase. The air felt solid, dense, like the world itself was closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned with the effort, but no air came. I felt my body start to tremble, my vision blurring at the edges, and for a moment, I thought I might lose myself to the darkness entirely. But then, as if in response to my desperation, a sound broke through the suffocating silence. A low, guttural growl, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. The figure paused, its head tilting slightly, as if listening. Then, it spoke again, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "It's too late." The word struck me like a slap. Too late for what? I tried to open my mouth to speak, to ask, but no words came. I couldn't form the thoughts. The air was too thick, the presence of the darkness too heavy. And then, as quickly as it had come, the figure stepped back into the shadows. The darkness retreated, pulling away like a wave receding into the ocean. The creatures, the twisted figures, vanished along with it, leaving only the faintest traces of their presence behind, the lingering smell, the echo of their footsteps in my mind. I was left standing in the park, gasping for breath, shaking uncontrollably, my heart pounding in my chest. The night felt different now, darker, colder, as though something inside me had changed, something I couldn't name. I had faced it. I had confronted the darkness. But it wasn't over. I could feel it still, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to return. And I knew one thing for certain, I would never escape it. Not now. Not ever. The darkness had claimed me. Days blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and endless unease. I tried to go about my life, to act as though nothing had changed, but I felt it, a weight, heavy and unyielding, pressing down on me. The world around me had become a shadow of itself, distorted and unreal, as though I were living in someone else's dream. The figures, those twisted beings, were no longer just a part of the park. They were in my thoughts, in the corners of my room, in the cracks of the sidewalk I walked on. The air always smelled faintly of rot, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see one of them standing there, waiting for me. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let them win. I had to find a way to end this, to escape the suffocating grasp of the darkness that clung to me. The nightmares came every night now, vivid, unrelenting. The creatures, the whispers, the shadow that had claimed me. They filled my dreams, tearing me apart in ways that felt so real I woke up with bruises, with aches in places I couldn't explain. My mind was unraveling, piece by piece, and I couldn't tell where the dream ended and reality began. And then, one night, I had a thought, a terrible, impossible thought. Maybe it wasn't the darkness I needed to fight. Maybe the only way to end this was to join it. I couldn't explain why this idea came to me or why I felt drawn to it. It was like a magnetic pull, a force I couldn't resist. I had become one with the night in some way, hadn't I? The creatures had claimed me. I had become a part of the shadows. So, maybe the only way to truly escape it was to embrace it completely. To give in. I knew the park would be waiting for me. It always was. So, that evening, I found myself standing at its edge once again. The trees loomed above me, their branches twisted like fingers reaching out of the dark. The pond was still, its surface as black as pitch, reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights in a way that made the world around it seem unreal. The air smelled like death, like decay. the same sickly, sour stench I had grown to fear. But tonight, I didn't flinch. Tonight, I welcomed it. I stepped forward, deeper into the park, and as I walked, I could feel the shadows closing in around me, pulling me deeper into their embrace. It wasn't just a smell anymore, it was the very essence of the night, the pulse of the creatures that roamed it. It was part of me now. I reached the pond, the water eerily still beneath the starless sky. The figures stood in the distance, watching me. I could feel them even if I couldn't see their eyes. They were waiting. And then I saw the figure again, the one that had spoken to me, the one that had risen from the pond. It was there, standing before me, its form more defined now, its presence consuming everything around it. The darkness wrapped around it like a cloak, an impenetrable void. It stepped forward, and I could feel its coldness, its hunger. It was drawing closer. "You have come to understand," it whispered, the words vibrating through my bones. I nodded, though I didn't trust my own voice to speak. I had come to this moment willingly, knowing there was no turning back. The figure raised its arm, and the shadows around me deepened, swirling like a storm. I could feel the pull of it, the pull of the night, and for the first time since this began, I felt a strange sense of peace. The fear that had gripped me for so long faded into the background, replaced by something colder, more certain. "You are no longer part of the world you knew," the figure spoke again, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You are part of the dark. Forever." I closed my eyes, letting the cold wash over me. The air thickened, the scent of rot filling my lungs, until it was all I could taste, all I could breathe. It was suffocating. It was alive. And then I felt it. A sharp, searing pain erupted through my chest, and I gasped, stumbling back. The world around me blurred, everything spinning, as though the very fabric of reality were tearing apart. I reached for my chest, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But there was no wound, no blood. It was something deeper, something worse. The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden in shadows. But I could feel it now, its presence filling every inch of me, as though it was inside my skin, inside my soul. "This is your last breath," it whispered. And for the first time, I understood. This wasn't just about escaping, about surviving. It wasn't even about the creatures or the darkness. It was about becoming a part of it. Becoming one with the void. The darkness didn't claim me because it wanted to destroy me. No. It claimed me because it was hungry. Hungry for something more than fear. Hungry for a soul. As the shadows closed in around me, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I finally let go. And in that moment, I knew with horrifying certainty, I had become the darkness. Have you ever wondered what might be hidden in places no one dares to visit? What lies in the quiet corners of the earth where the ground itself seems to be alive, swallowing everything that touches it? I did, one evening, on the outskirts of town. I had been hiking, following the worn trail that led through thick woods, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt an unsettling pull to continue, despite the fading light. The world around me felt quieter than usual. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Something was wrong. I had heard whispers about the place before. Old-timers in the village spoke of the swamp, saying it was cursed. They warned travelers to stay away, but there was never any real explanation, just the same nervous glances and hurried silences whenever it was brought up. Curiosity, I suppose, as a way of drowning out common sense. I stumbled upon it quite unexpectedly, the house. It was there, just off the beaten path, partially sunken into the swamp. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, a trick of the mind playing with the fading light. But no! It was real. A dilapidated house, half covered in thick mud, like it had been consumed by the very earth beneath it. The windows were dark, broken in places, and the roof sagged as though it had been pushed down by an invisible weight. The air around it smelled stale, like old leaves and something else, something I couldn't quite place, but it made my skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, uncertain. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, to leave before I got any closer. But something kept me rooted to the spot. I took a few tentative steps forward, the ground soft beneath my feet. With each step, the air seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating, as if the house itself was drawing me in. I pushed open the broken door with a creak that sounded far too loud in the stillness. Inside, the air was thick with dust and dampness, the walls coated in a layer of grime. But what caught my attention were the marks. The handprints. They were on the walls, all around the entrance. Fresh. Not just smudges of dirt or streaks of mold, but clear, deliberate handprints. Large and small, some smeared as though the person, if you could call them that, had been dragged, others placed carefully, like a child's innocent touch. They seemed to pulse, as if they were still wet, still warm. I reached out, my hand trembling, to touch one of the prints. But the moment my fingers made contact, something strange happened. The mark didn't smear. It stayed there, perfectly intact. And then, to my horror, I saw it. The handprint slowly began to darken, as though someone, or something, was pressing against the other side of the wall. I jerked my hand away, my heart hammering in my chest. The air was colder now, and I could hear a faint sound, something soft, like whispering. It seemed to come from the very walls, as though the house itself was trying to speak. But the sound was distant, layered, like voices from another time, trapped within the structure. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The house felt like it was breathing. The floor creaked underfoot, and I took a cautious step further into the room. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they knew I was there. As if they were aware of my presence. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But my legs felt heavy, as if the very ground beneath me was pulling me deeper into the house. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, quick, fleeting, like someone had moved across the room. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing. Just the same decaying walls, the same flickering light from the broken window. The temperature dropped again, and I could feel the presence of something else, something unseen, just out of reach. I wasn't alone in this house. Whatever had left the handprints was still here, waiting. I took another step, my instinct screaming to run, but my curiosity, my need to understand, kept me rooted to the spot. I reached out and touched another handprint. This time, the wall felt cold to the touch, almost painfully so, as if it had been frozen. And, once again, the print began to change, darkening, shifting, as though it was reacting to my touch. I couldn't stop myself. I kept touching the marks, one after another, each time feeling the chill, hearing the whispers grow louder, more urgent, as if the house itself was trying to warn me. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. I pulled my hand back, my breath catching in my throat. The silence that followed was deafening. The house, once full of a low hum, now felt empty. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it. A presence, something old, something ancient, watching me. And then, with a suddenness that made my heart skip a beat, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my body frozen with fear, as the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward me. The handprints, once faint and unclear, were now all around me, covering every inch of the walls. The whispers returned, now a chorus, overlapping, growing louder and louder, until they were all I could hear. They were no longer distant. They were right there, just behind me, in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to escape. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the air grew heavier, as if the house itself was alive, hungry. One thing was certain now, I wasn't going to leave. Not by my own will, anyway. The house and the mire had claimed me, and there was no way out. The silence that followed the door slamming shut was suffocating. My heartbeat was the loudest sound in the room, thumping painfully in my chest. The whispers, those low, guttural sounds that had once been distant, now swirled around me like a tangible presence, filling the space and wrapping themselves around my thoughts. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel their urgency, their hunger. I backed up, my hands brushing the walls, searching for an escape, any way out. But the walls felt wrong, slick and cold, as though the house itself had absorbed the dampness of the swamp outside. The once faint handprints were now growing, multiplying across the surface, as if something or someone were pressing against the walls from within, leaving their mark. The air was thick, oppressive, and the smell of decay that had hung in the air since I entered the house seemed to grow stronger, overwhelming my senses. It wasn't just the rot of the swamp anymore. It was something deeper, more ancient. Something hungry. I moved towards the window, my hands shaking as I gripped the frame. But it was no use. The glass was so clouded with grime and dirt that I couldn't see through it. I pounded on the window, the sound echoing in the empty house, but it was no use. The house had swallowed me whole. The whispers had stopped, but in that place, I began to hear something else. A faint tapping, like fingers drumming on the floor, followed by a slow, dragging sound as if something heavy was being pulled across the room. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming closer. Something was moving in the darkness. Something that didn't want to be seen. My mind raced. I needed to escape. But where could I go? Every inch of this house felt like it was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The longer I stayed, the more I felt it, this oppressive presence, the weight of something ancient and dark that had claimed this house long ago. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. I didn't know by what or who, but I could feel the pressure building around me, tightening like a noose. Suddenly, a loud thud broke the silence. My body went rigid, my legs frozen in place. The sound had come from upstairs, from the direction of the second floor. The tapping had stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging as if the person, or whatever it was struggling to move. I forced my legs to move, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet betrayed me, as if they were stuck in place, unwilling to leave the safety of the room. But I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this room with the shadows closing in. I turned towards the stairs that led up to the second floor, my eyes drawn to the dim light at the top of the staircase. The air was colder now, biting against my skin, and I felt the pull again, like something was calling me, drawing me upwards. Despite every instinct in my body telling me to turn around, to run, I found myself walking toward the stairs, each step heavy with dread. The house creaked and groaned under my weight, the walls vibrating with an almost imperceptible hum. The footsteps above me had stopped, but the silence was worse now, pregnant with anticipation. The presence that had been lurking in the house seemed to be waiting for me, watching me from the shadows. As I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated, my hand gripping the railing tightly. The door at the end of the hall stood ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling from it like ink spreading across paper. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel the weight of something terrible waiting behind that door. But I couldn't stop myself. Something was drawing me closer. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room inside was barren, just an empty, decaying space with peeling wallpaper and cracked floors. But there, on the far wall, were more handprints. Larger this time, more distinct. They were smeared, as though someone had dragged their hands across the surface, but the prints weren't fading. They were fresh. As if someone, or something, was still here. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the far corner, its face hidden in shadow. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch beyond human proportions. It didn't move, didn't speak. But I could feel its presence, like it was reaching out to me, drawing me in. I took a step forward, then another, and then, before I could stop myself, I was moving towards it. My feet felt as though they were moving of their own accord, dragging me closer to the figure in the corner. The air grew colder still, and the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They were no longer just in my ears. They were inside my head, filling my thoughts, pushing against the edges of my sanity. The figure stepped forward. It was tall, too tall, and the darkness around it seemed to cling to its form like a cloak. As it moved, I could hear a faint scratching sound, like claws dragging against wood. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. The figure reached out with long, spindly fingers, and I felt a coldness like ice touch my skin. And then, in a voice that was nothing more than a whisper in the wind, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating with the weight of something ancient, something that had existed far longer than this house, far longer than the swamp. Something that had been waiting for me, waiting for someone to cross the threshold. I finally found the strength to move, to run, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the darkness with the creature. I had come too far to escape. The house in the mire had claimed me. And now, it wasn't going to let me go. I ran. My feet pounded against the rotting wood of the hallway, the sound of my footsteps mixing with the relentless whispers that followed me. The cold, clammy air pressed against my face as I bolted down the stairs, my mind racing. I couldn't let it catch me. I couldn't let it. A sharp, guttural screech split the silence, followed by a low, dragging sound that sent a wave of panic through my body. The thing was behind me. I could hear it, feel it, like it was closing in from all sides. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled toward the door I had come through earlier, but as my hand reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, or worse, it was never meant to open. I pulled and yanked at the door, but it held firm, the wood groaning in protest. Desperation clawed at my insides. I spun around, searching for any other way out. But the house, the walls, the very air seemed to close in on me. I didn't know how long I had been running, or if I had been running in circles. The same handprints on the walls. The same dark shadows in the corners. The same low whispers that seemed to be growing louder. Every room I entered felt like a repetition of the last. I was trapped in a maze that I couldn't escape, and the house, it seemed, was reshaping itself to keep me in. Suddenly, the floor beneath me shifted with a loud crack, and I froze. The house groaned, the walls creaking as though they were alive, shifting, adjusting. The floor began to warp and bend, the wooden planks bowing inward, as though trying to trap me in their grasp. I jumped back, but my feet slid on the slick surface. The walls seemed to move, too, pressing in from all sides, as if the house itself had turned against me, a living, breathing thing. I backed away, but no matter which way I turned, the walls seemed to follow. The doorways were narrowing, the windows filling with shadow. It felt as though the very dimensions of the house were twisting, folding into themselves. I was no longer sure if I was inside a house or something else entirely. The lines between the two had blurred. My mind reeled, and I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The whispers became louder, more urgent, and I realized they weren't just voices. They were commands. Faint, barely audible, but they were there. Phrases like stay, wait, don't leave. Each word felt like a weight pressing against my mind, making my thoughts heavier, slower, as though the house was trying to drag me down into its depths. The thing that had been watching me, the tall figure with the shadowy face, it was still there. I could feel its presence lurking in the corners of the rooms, in the very walls, watching me. And I knew, with a horrible certainty, that it wasn't just waiting for me to give in. It was feeding on my fear. I stumbled toward the stairs again, my legs unsteady, but before I could reach them, something moved in the corner of my eye. A shape. A blur. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. There was a figure standing at the end of the hall, tall and thin, its body elongated, its face obscured by the same darkness that had enveloped it before. But this time, it was different. Its presence was stronger, closer. And I could hear it breathing now. Slow, labored breaths, as if it was just as eager to catch me as I was to escape. I froze. My body refused to move, the terror washing over me like a wave. The figure took a step forward, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its head tilting slightly, as if it was studying me. The whispers grew louder, louder than ever before, until they were all I could hear. There were no words now, just the sound of 1,000 voices overlapping, all trying to speak at once. And then it moved. Fast. Too fast. It lunged at me, and I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, my body refusing to obey my commands. But just as the thing's cold, skeletal hand reached out for me, the walls shifted again. I screamed as the floor beneath me gave way. I fell. For what felt like an eternity, I plummeted, my body tumbling through the air, my mind spinning. The darkness swallowed me whole, and I couldn't tell which way was up, which way was down. The last thing I remembered before I hit the ground was the feeling of something cold and wet wrapping around my ankle, dragging me down further. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a different place. The ground beneath me was soft, muddy. I could feel the swamp water seeping through my clothes, the coldness biting at my skin. But the house, it was gone. There was no sign of it. No crumbling walls, no dark corners. Just the swamp stretching out endlessly before me. I tried to sit up, but my body felt weak, as though it had been drained of all energy. The whispers were gone, but the terror still clung to me, suffocating like a dark cloud that refused to leave. I could feel the presence of the house still, though. It wasn't over. I hadn't escaped. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. I fell to the ground, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. But something was wrong. The swamp, it wasn't still. It was moving. The mud beneath me was shifting, rippling, as if something was coming closer. Slowly, I forced myself to look up. In the distance, I saw it. The house, or what was left of it. It stood at the edge of the swamp, half sunken, like it had been there all along, waiting for me. The windows were dark, but I could feel eyes watching me. The whispers had returned, faint, but they were there. And this time, they weren't in my head. They were coming from the house. You can't leave. Not until it has you. I looked down at my hands. The mud was thick, but I could see something. Handprints. Fresh handprints, just like the ones I had seen inside. Only now, they were on me. The house and the mire had claimed me, and I could never escape. I tried to move, to escape, but the weight of the swamp's grip on me seemed stronger now, pulling me deeper into the muck. The earth beneath me quaked, shifting like it had a mind of its own. Each step I took, every attempt to free myself, only dragged me further into the mire, the dark water swallowing my legs, tightening like a vice. The house, looming in the distance, was not just a building anymore. It was an anchor, an enormous force that tugged at my soul. The whispers, growing louder again, felt closer, like they were surrounding me, weaving in and out of my consciousness. I could hear them in the wind, in the rustling of the trees, in the very air I breathed. They were no longer faint murmurs, they were clear and persistent, calling me back. Come back. Come back to us. I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to hear them. But my body, my legs, my hands betrayed me. The mud around me seemed to pulse, like it was alive, feeding off my fear. It was suffocating, draining me of any strength, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse right there, buried alive in this foul, stagnant swamp. But then, just as I felt the weight of the mire pulling me down for good, I heard something else. A voice, sharp and urgent, cutting through the whispers. Leave. Run. It was a voice I recognized, though I didn't know from where. The command was almost too loud, too real, to ignore. I snapped my head up, searching desperately for its source. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't coming from the house. It wasn't coming from anywhere nearby. It felt distant, but it was clear, like someone, or something, was calling from far beyond the swamp, from the very edge of the earth. With the last of my strength, I pulled my foot from the sticky mud and staggered forward. Every movement felt like a battle, like I was wading through tar, but the voice kept pushing me onward. Leave. It wants you. It always has. The words sent a chill down my spine, making every hair on my body stand on end. I could feel it then. The presence in the house, the thing that had been watching me, that had been following me, was reaching for me again, trying to draw me back into the place of shadows. But now, I understood. It wasn't just trying to trap me. It was trying to feed on me. And once it had me, there would be no escape. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach churned. The house was shifting again, its dark silhouette standing at the edge of the swamp like some ancient predator, waiting for me to give in. I could hear the faint sound of scraping, like nails against wood. And I could feel its eyes, even if I couldn't see them. I pushed harder, stumbling through the muck, feeling the swamp's cold fingers close tighter around my legs. The whispers were louder now, more frantic, more insistent. Stay. Don't leave. You belong to us. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and for a split second, the water around me surged as if some invisible hand had shoved me forward. I fell to the ground, my face splashing into the mud, gasping for air. The whispers had stopped. The air was eerily still, as though everything had held its breath. But I couldn't rest. I couldn't stop. I staggered to my feet again, my hands trembling as I wiped the grime from my face. It wasn't over. The house, it was still coming for me. It was never going to let me go. With every ounce of willpower, I forced my legs to carry me forward. And then, in the distance, through the fog, I saw it, a break in the swamp. A sliver of land that wasn't covered in muck. An escape. The edges of the swamp, the boundary that had once seemed like the end of the world, were within reach. But as I took one last step forward, something moved in the water behind me. The house. It was no longer a shadow on the horizon. It had shifted. It was closer now, rising out of the swamp, its form warped, distorted, like it was rising from the very depths of the earth. The windows were dark, but the lights flickered within them, like something was trying to peer out, trying to see me, to call me back. The whispers roared again, a cacophony of voices, pleading, screaming, begging me to return. They were pulling me back. My feet were frozen, caught between the will to escape and the fear that held me still. The mire beneath me seemed to pull harder, and I felt the weight of something heavy, something ancient, bearing down on me. Suddenly, a cold, wet hand gripped my ankle. I screamed, the sound echoing in the night, as I was yanked back toward the swamp. I fought, kicking, clawing at the mud, but it held firm, pulling me down. My body was heavy, sinking, as though the earth itself had come alive, determined to claim me. You belong here now. You can never leave. The voice was clear now, right in my ear, but I couldn't see its source. I couldn't see anything. The darkness had taken over again, swallowing everything around me. The world had dissolved into shadows, into the wet, choking air of the swamp. And then, just as the last bit of light faded from my vision, I felt it, the pull, the hunger, and I knew. I had become part of it. The house in the mire would never let go. When I woke, I wasn't sure if I had ever truly awakened. I lay still, floating in darkness, the air thick and suffocating. My body felt different, heavier, as though it wasn't mine anymore. I could hear my heart beating, slow and weak, but it was muffled by something, a strange pressure that seemed to press in from all sides. My eyes, though open, saw nothing but black. Not even the faintest glimmer of light. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't respond. I couldn't feel them. I couldn't feel anything except the weight of the darkness pressing on me. The whispers were gone. But in their place, there was a low hum, like the sound of an ancient machine grinding deep below the surface. It was as though the very ground I lay on was alive, pulsing with some kind of forgotten rhythm, pulling me further into it. It was then that I realized I wasn't in the swamp anymore. Or, if I was, it wasn't the same swamp. The air was still thick, but the smell of decay was gone. There was only a cold, metallic scent, something that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to speak, but no sound came from my mouth. My throat was dry, parched. My skin felt clammy, sticky, as though I was drenched in something I couldn't see. Then, as if from the farthest reaches of my mind, came a voice. It was a single word, sharp and clear. Welcome. The voice was so familiar, yet so different. I couldn't place it. My heart thudded in my chest as the darkness shifted around me, twisting and warping. It was as though the very space I was in was bending, reshaping itself. And then I saw it. The walls. They were closing in, slowly, like the tightening grip of a swamp, only this time there was no mud, no water. Just walls of black, liquid shadows, moving, oozing as if they had a life of their own. The floor beneath me was no longer solid, but soft, like wet earth, yet it didn't give way when I shifted. It was as though I was sinking, but not in the way I had before. Not in the mire. It was a different kind of sinking. One that felt like my very soul was being pulled under, swallowed by the vast emptiness. I tried to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. I could feel my chest tighten, as if something was pressing on my ribs. My breath came in ragged gasps, but there was no escape. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, and the deeper hum beneath it, a low growl, like something else, something much older, was awake now. And then I saw it, moving slowly in the corner of my vision. A figure. Tall. Thin. Its limbs twisted, its body distorted like the house itself had become part of it. The same figure that had haunted me in the house. But it was different now. Its presence was larger, darker, more consuming. The figure was no longer just a shape in the corner of my mind, it was real. And it was coming toward me. I wanted to move, to run, but my body refused. My legs were frozen. My hands couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in this place, a place that felt like it existed outside time, outside reality. The figure inched closer, its face still hidden in shadow, but I could feel it. I could feel its eyes on me, seeing through me, hearing my every thought, my every fear. It stopped, just in front of me, and in that moment, I could hear it, its voice. It was no longer just the whispering voices I had heard before. It was the same voice, but now it was all around me. In my ears. In my mind. You thought you could leave. You thought you could escape. But you never truly left, did you? You belong to us now. You are part of the house, part of the mire. There is no way out. The figure stepped forward, its form flickering, shifting like smoke. I could see its hand, long, bony, reaching for me. And as it touched my skin, I felt it. The cold. The pull. It was like my very essence was being drawn into it, as if my memories, my thoughts, my very being was being consumed. But just before everything was swallowed by the darkness, before I became one with the house itself, I felt a jolt. A sharp, sudden pain shot through my chest, like a crack splitting through my ribs. I gasped, the air rushing into my lungs, and for a brief moment, I was free. I was awake. I bolted upright, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My eyes shot open, but the world around me was blurry, hazy. I felt the ground beneath me, solid and real, but it was wrong. It was too real. The air smelled foul, like old earth, damp and rotten. The sky above me was a sickly shade of gray, and the trees. They were twisted, their branches reaching like claws, too still, too silent. I staggered to my feet, my hands shaking. And then, I saw it again. The house. It was there, standing in the distance, half sunken, just like before. But this time, it wasn't just the house that called to me. It was the swamp. The mire. It was all around me, the dark, inescapable grip of it pulling me back. The house wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a building. It was alive. And now it was part of me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My feet were stuck, rooted to the ground, as the house watched me, the dark figure standing in its window. And I knew I would never leave. The house in the mire had taken me, and now I was part of its story. Forever. Have you ever had the feeling that something just isn't right in your own home? It's subtle at first, easy to dismiss as your imagination, but it nags at you. A strange creak in the floor, an unusual shadow at the corner of your eye. It doesn't help that the house is new, the walls still holding that fresh, sterile scent of untouched paint and furniture. But sometimes, in a new space, things don't settle in quite as they should. Sometimes, you feel like you're not truly alone. It all began a few days after I moved into my new apartment. It was a small, cozy space on the third floor of a building that looked a bit too old for its own good. There were no major flaws, nothing that screamed danger or disturbance. Just a normal place, or so I thought. But there was one thing that stood out: the stairs. At first, I didn't notice them. It was an ordinary apartment, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room. The kind of place you settle into, put down roots, and forget about the details. But one evening, while I was cleaning up the spare room, I noticed a strange indentation in the floor near the far wall. I hadn't seen it before, nor had I noticed a door there. Curious, I bent down and ran my hand over the spot, feeling a small shift in the floorboards. When I stood, I realized what I was looking at. A door. It was set into the wall, the edges slightly hidden by the furniture and clutter. I must have passed it a dozen times before without ever noticing. I reached for the knob, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily. The door opened with a soft creak, and there it was, a narrow, steep staircase leading down into the darkness. No windows. No light. It wasn't supposed to be there. I had the floor plan. I had seen the blueprint of the apartment. There were no stairs in that space. I had to be mistaken. But the door was real, and so was the staircase. I stood frozen at the threshold, my breath catching in my chest. The air felt colder here, colder than the rest of the apartment. A strange draft seemed to swirl up from the darkness below, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. I could hear my heartbeat loud in my ears, like a drum urging me to move forward or to run away. But something kept me standing there, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me down the stairs, step by tentative step. The air grew colder, heavier, as if I was descending into something far deeper than just a lower floor. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the farther I went, the more oppressive the silence felt. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. It wasn't large, maybe just enough room for a desk and a chair. But in the center of the room was something that caught my eye. A large mirror, standing against the wall, covered in dust. The mirror was old, with an ornate frame that seemed out of place in the otherwise plain space. I couldn't help but approach it, drawn to its reflective surface. As I stood before it, I tried to wipe some of the dust away, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the mirror didn't want to be cleaned. I stared at my reflection, waiting for the dust to clear, but then something happened. A movement. Just behind me. I froze, staring into the mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was someone standing behind me. A figure. Tall, almost too tall, and unnaturally still. I could see their shadow reflected in the mirror, but when I turned around to face them, the room was empty. No one. My pulse raced. I looked back into the mirror, and the figure was still there, standing exactly where it had been. I could feel the coldness of their presence behind me, even though I knew I was alone in the room. Slowly, I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the glass. It was cold. Ice cold. Suddenly, the air felt like it was being sucked out of the room, the pressure building up around me. The figure in the mirror shifted, just slightly, its form becoming more defined, its face now visible. But what I saw didn't make sense. It was me, but not quite. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine entirely. It was a twisted version of me, my face, but wrong. The eyes were darker, empty, like hollow sockets, and the expression on the reflection's face was one of deep sorrow. Or perhaps something worse. Its lips barely moved, but I could hear its voice. "Why did you come?" I stumbled back, horrified. The figure didn't move, it just stared at me with those empty eyes. It was me, but it wasn't. The room around me seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate in that small, dark space. I tried to tear my gaze away from the mirror, but something held me there. It felt as though the reflection was pulling me in, as if I were drowning in its eyes. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it whispered again, and I felt the words vibrate in my skull, like they were coming from inside my own head. I turned and fled, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. That something was always just behind me. I rushed back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me, but the oppressive feeling remained. I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind. The way it stood, so still, so lifeless, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. And I knew, deep down, that I hadn't seen the last of it. The days after that incident felt different. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind, a figment of my imagination, maybe brought on by stress or the unsettling isolation of living in a new place. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, I couldn't forget the figure in the mirror. Its hollow eyes haunted me, and that voice, whispering in my mind, echoed through the silence of my apartment. I couldn't go back to the room downstairs. I couldn't even bring myself to look at the door that had led to the stairs. Every time I walked past it, my chest tightened, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I tried to block it out, tried to tell myself that I was being irrational, but something inside me knew that I had uncovered something I wasn't supposed to see. And it wasn't just the door or the mirror that troubled me. It was the feeling of being watched, like invisible eyes were constantly on me, studying my every move. That night, I couldn't sleep. The apartment, despite its quiet, felt suffocating. Every creak of the building seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall. But then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone was walking on the floor above me, but as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, closer. I told myself it was just the building settling, the pipes expanding with the night's chill. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved across the ceiling, coming closer, circling around me. The sound seemed to follow the exact path of the stairs leading down to that room. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing to see, nothing to explain the noise. I tried to shake off the panic rising in my throat and stood up to investigate. I walked through the apartment, my footsteps quiet in the thick silence, my eyes darting from one corner of the room to another, expecting to find something lurking there. When I reached the far end of the apartment, where the door to the stairs was hidden, I hesitated. The floor beneath me felt oddly soft, as though it was yielding to the weight of my presence, as though the very foundation of the building was waiting. I couldn't help it. I had to look again. Slowly, my hand reached for the door. The brass knob was cold, colder than I remembered, and as I turned it, a chill spread through my fingers. The door creaked open, just as it had that first time, and I stepped into the dim hallway. This time, I didn't wait. I walked down the stairs quickly, as if trying to outrun whatever had been following me. At the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The room was the same as before, but something was different. The mirror, once covered in dust, was clean. Its surface cleaned, untouched. But that wasn't the worst part. The table had changed. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I saw it clearly. The edges of the wooden table were worn, scratched, as if someone had been using it. As if someone had been here recently. And sitting atop the table, next to the mirror, was a small photograph. I reached for it with trembling hands, and as I picked it up, a cold wave of dread washed over me. The photograph was old, its edges curled, the colors faded. It showed a man and a woman standing in front of a house that looked eerily similar to the one I was living in, same architecture, same weathered stone. They were smiling, but there was something unsettling about the photo. The woman's eyes were hollow, just like the figure in the mirror. And the man, his face was unfamiliar, but the expression on it. I couldn't place it. It was the same expression I had seen on my own reflection. I dropped the photo, my hands shaking. My mind was racing. Why was this here? Who had left it? And why did it look like the house I was living in? I turned to face the mirror once again, but this time I didn't see my reflection. Instead, I saw the woman from the photograph, standing just behind me, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me screamed to run. Then, a voice, barely audible, whispered in my ear, "You're next." The room spun around me. The walls felt as if they were closing in, pressing down on me. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The woman in the mirror smiled, an impossibly wide grin, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't understand. And then, without warning, the room fell silent again. The pressure around me lifted, but the air was thick, suffocating. The mirror was empty now, nothing but my reflection staring back at me. But I knew, deep down, that whatever was behind that mirror was still there, waiting. I ran back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding, my chest tight with terror. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that I was being pulled into something from which there would be no escape. And worst of all, I knew that it wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was me. Something had marked me, and there was no turning back. Days blurred into one another after that night. I tried to live normally, to go through the motions of daily life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if I was living in two worlds, the one where everything appeared normal on the surface, and the one where an unseen force was slowly pulling at the edges of my reality. I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror and the woman. She had been so real, too real. I could still see her face in my mind, feel her cold breath on the back of my neck. The worst part was that I knew she wasn't a figment of my imagination. She was connected to that room downstairs, that house, my house. I tried to avoid the stairs. I stayed upstairs as much as possible, trying not to think about what lay below. But the house seemed to have a life of its own, and no matter how much I resisted, it was always calling me back. The silence in the apartment became deafening, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in, suffocating me. One night, after I had convinced myself to sleep despite the dread gnawing at my insides, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder. A soft tapping, tap, 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 like fingernails on wood. My breath hitched, and I sat up, straining to listen. It was coming from below. The stairs. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening, something was moving. I didn't want to face it, but deep down, I knew I had no choice. I climbed out of bed, trying not to make a sound, and moved to the door. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if it was calling me. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The temperature had dropped. The air was heavy, damp, like it had been soaked in the kind of stillness that only comes with something ancient, something forgotten. The tapping continued, growing louder with every step I took toward the stairs. My body trembled with fear, but I forced myself to move forward, unable to resist the pull of that sound. When I reached the base of the stairs, I saw it. A shadow, dark and shifting, stood at the bottom of the staircase. At first, it looked like nothing more than an odd reflection, a trick of the light. But as I focused on it, I saw that it was too solid to be a mere illusion. The figure was tall, looming in the darkness, its outline indistinct, as if it were both there and not there at the same time. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and in that silence, I felt the presence of something I couldn't understand. It was a weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The figure in the dark didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting. And then, in a voice that was both distant and right beside me, I heard the words. "Come closer." My legs felt like they were made of lead. My body screamed at me to turn and run, but I couldn't move. The air around me thickened, pressing in on all sides. The figure in the darkness seemed to grow taller, its outline becoming more distinct, more defined. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the figure stepped forward. I stumbled back, falling against the wall, and as I looked up, I saw it, the face. It was not human. The features were distorted, an amalgamation of something familiar and something grotesque. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, glowing with a cold, otherworldly light. And its mouth was open in a smile, but it was not a smile of kindness. It was a smile that stretched too wide, too thin, like something not meant to be. Before I could react, it was gone. The tapping started again. Soft at first, then growing louder. The figure had vanished into the darkness, but the noise persisted, like something was moving in the shadows, waiting for me to follow. I couldn't stay here anymore. I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, my body drenched in sweat. I tried to tell myself that I had imagined it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. That thing downstairs was real. It was waiting for me. And it wouldn't stop until I faced it. I stayed in my room, barricaded in for the rest of the night, listening to the sounds from below. The tapping never stopped. The silence, once so comforting, now felt like a trap. The question that plagued me, the one I couldn't shake, was simple: what does it want? But I already knew the answer. It wasn't about what it wanted. It was about what it needed. And that was me. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The days felt like they stretched on forever, each one heavier than the last. The tapping had not ceased, and the figure, whatever it was, remained in the shadows, just beyond the reach of my understanding. It was clear now that it wasn't simply a haunting. It was something far worse. I couldn't tell anyone. No one would believe me. The building had a long history, and I knew better than to share the terror that gripped me. People would think I was losing my mind. But I could feel it, deep inside. The pull was getting stronger. The house, this cursed, twisted place, was calling to me. That night, something changed. The air around me was thick with anticipation, and as I lay in bed, I realized I could no longer ignore the urge to go down to that room again. The whispers that had plagued my dreams began to surface in the waking world. The tapping from the stairs had become louder, faster, almost impatient. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and stood up, my limbs stiff and trembling. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been, and my breath fogged in the air. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, feeling the familiar weight of dread settle on my shoulders. I approached the stairs, and to my horror, the door that had once separated the stairwell from the rest of the house was now wide open. It had never been open before. The stairs stretched down into the darkness, the narrow passage swallowing the light from my flashlight, leaving only an eerie blackness. The tapping, now much louder, seemed to echo up from the depths, its rhythm mocking me. With each step I took, the sense of inevitability grew. There was no turning back now. I was compelled to descend, my feet moving almost of their own accord. The flashlight's beam danced across the walls, casting strange shadows, each one more unsettling than the last. I reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. The room was just as I had left it, the old wooden table, the mirror, and the suffocating stillness. But there was something new, something more disturbing. The mirror was shattered. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, jagged and chaotic, as though something had violently struck it. The fragments reflected the room in strange angles, distorting reality. But even more unsettling were the stains on the floor beneath the mirror. Red. Blood. Or something that resembled it. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. My feet were rooted to the floor, as if the house itself had claimed me, holding me in place. From the broken mirror, a new figure appeared. The woman, no longer just a shadow in the reflection, stepped out of the shattered glass. Her face was twisted, her smile stretched wider than it should have been. Her eyes were no longer hollow, but gleamed with malice. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice a soft hiss that crawled into my ears like the cold wind of an impending storm. I stepped back, my heart racing. But the woman, no, the thing, moved closer, her form distorting with every step. Her body seemed to blur, flickering in and out of focus like a bad signal on an old television screen. Her voice grew louder, as though it was coming from all directions at once. "You can't leave now. You're already here. Forever." I turned to flee, but the moment I took a step, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. My chest tightened, panic rising in my throat. There was no escape. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing smaller with each passing second. The mirrors that lined the walls, there were more now, reflected a twisted version of myself, each one more contorted and grotesque than the last. Suddenly, the room went cold, colder than I could have imagined. I could see my breath in the air. And then, with a suddenness that left me breathless, I heard it, the tapping again. But this time, it was different. It was coming from behind me. I turned, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows. But it wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in darkness. The thing moved closer, and I could feel its presence as if it were pressing against my very soul. Its form was blurry, like it didn't belong in this world. It had no face, no features, just an empty space where a person should be. "It's your turn," the voice whispered, echoing from every direction. "Come with me." I wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat. My legs refused to move, frozen in place. The room seemed to tilt, as if gravity itself was turning against me. The figure in the dark reached out, its arms long and impossibly thin. And then, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I realized the truth. The house didn't want me to leave. It didn't just want me to stay, it needed me to become part of it. The darkness closed in, and I felt myself falling, not physically, but inside. My body felt weightless, as though the ground had disappeared entirely beneath me. The thing in the shadows, it moved closer still, its form flickering in and out of existence. There was no escaping it. No reason. No hope. And yet, a strange calmness began to settle over me. I realized with a jolt that I wasn't afraid anymore, not in the way I had been before. I wasn't fighting it. I wasn't running. I had already become part of this twisted world, this house that seemed to thrive on fear. My breath slowed, my thoughts muddled, and I felt distant. As if I were observing this moment from somewhere far away, watching it happen to someone else. "You're here now," the voice whispered again, louder this time, almost laughing. "You belong to us now." The figure, if it could be called that, reached for me. Its long fingers curled with unnatural grace, and its touch felt like cold metal on my skin, sending waves of numbness through my body. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't work. The walls seemed to stretch outward, and I could hear the mirror fragments rattle, their surfaces cracking even more. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by the thing in the dark, but time had no meaning anymore. I could feel my body growing weaker, my legs buckling beneath me. I tried to raise my arm, to reach for the stairs or anything that might give me a chance to escape, but it was futile. Then, as suddenly as the darkness had consumed me, I found myself in the room again. The room with the table and the broken mirror. But it was different now. Everything was wrong. The air felt thick with something unspeakable, and I could hear faint whispers in the distance, voices that didn't belong to the house, voices that weren't human. The figure was gone. In its place, standing before the shattered glass of the mirror, was something far worse, myself. But it wasn't me. Not completely. The reflection in the mirror was twisted, grotesque. My face was pale, too pale, with hollow eyes staring back at me. My mouth stretched into that same wide, unnerving smile that I had seen on the thing's face before. The glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, distorting the image further. I could feel the glass pulling me toward it, as if it were trying to swallow me whole. I stepped back, but it didn't matter. The reflection in the mirror didn't move with me. It stayed where I had been, standing there with its unnatural smile. And then, something changed. The reflection's eyes, my eyes, shifted. They weren't the same anymore. They glowed with a malevolent light, a chilling light that mirrored the one I had seen in the shadows. It wasn't just a reflection. It was something else. "You can't leave," the voice came again, this time directly from the mirror. It wasn't the same voice I had heard before, but something deeper, older, like the house itself speaking through the reflection. I backed away, frantic now, searching for an exit, but the room had changed. The walls were no longer solid. They were made of shifting shadows, stretching and bending as though the very fabric of reality was warping around me. The stairs were gone. The door was gone. There was nothing left but the mirror. And the reflection. "You are part of us now," it whispered, its voice a chorus of voices, all overlapping one another, whispering in a language that made my skin crawl. "We are the house. And you are ours." I could feel myself being pulled toward the mirror, my body no longer my own, as though the house had claimed me completely. My legs moved against my will, and as I reached for the glass, my hand touched its cold surface. The moment my fingers brushed the mirror, everything stopped. The room, the whispers, the dark figure, all of it vanished. I was standing in the hallway again, as though nothing had happened. The door at the top of the stairs was closed. I couldn't remember how I had gotten back up here. My mind was hazy, and my body felt strange, disconnected. The apartment seemed normal again, the way it had been before all of this began. But something was off. I moved into the living room, my legs unsteady, and there, on the wall, was a mirror. I had never seen it there before, but there it was, its surface glinting faintly under the dim light. I approached it slowly, my breath catching in my throat. I saw my reflection, my face, my eyes, but then, just as I stepped closer, the smile twisted. It wasn't mine. And then I knew. I had never left. I had never escaped. The house had let me think I was free, but it had only been a trap. And I would never be able to leave again. Not truly. Because the house had claimed me. And now, I was part of it. Have you ever noticed something strange about a place you visit every day? Something that you'd never paid attention to before, but once you do, it feels like the whole world shifts around you? It starts small. A flicker. A glance. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. It began with the light in the apartment across the street. I had lived in this building for months, and I never really paid attention to the windows of the apartment across the way. It was just another part of the city skyline, just another apartment that flickered to life at dusk. But one evening, I couldn't help but notice that the same window, always the same, was lit in the same way, with the same faint, yellowish glow. It was so consistent, so regular, that I began to expect it. It almost felt like the apartment was waiting for me to look. At first, I thought it was nothing. Perhaps someone left a light on or had a strange habit of keeping the lamp on late at night. But after a while, the light became a kind of presence, a quiet companion to my evenings. I didn't even realize it at first, but I began looking for that window as soon as I sat down in my living room. It was as though it was pulling me in, gently tugging at my attention. Then one night, I noticed something different. The light was still there, as it always was, but tonight, I swear it flickered. Just once. A brief, almost imperceptible blink that shouldn't have meant anything at all. But it did. It caught my eye, and my heart raced. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the fluttering sensation growing in my chest. But I couldn't stop watching. I stared at that window for what felt like hours. It became more than just a light. It became alive, as if the apartment itself were watching me as much as I was watching it. I leaned closer to the window, my forehead pressed against the glass. The city outside was silent, the usual hum of traffic and chatter dulled under the thick blanket of night. I thought I saw movement. A shadow, just for a second. A flicker, like someone had passed by the window. But there was no sound. No footsteps. Just the faint glow that had been there all evening. I pulled back from the window, unnerved. It was nothing, I told myself. I was tired. It was late. But still, the feeling lingered. That unsettling sense that something, or someone, was watching me back. The next evening, I found myself drawn to the window again. I had convinced myself it was just a light, just a normal, everyday thing. But as I looked at it from across the street, I noticed something new. The light flickered again, this time for longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was intentional. It wasn't just a light anymore. It was a signal. A communication, though I couldn't understand what it meant. I walked closer to the window, the sense of unease growing heavier in my chest. The glow was brighter now, too bright for the dim streetlights below. I could make out the faintest outline of something or someone standing just beyond the glow. It wasn't clear, it wasn't sharp, but there was movement. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Was someone inside that apartment? No one had ever moved in or out that I'd noticed. The apartment across from mine had always been dark, save for the glowing light. But tonight felt different. My heart began to pound as I turned to face the window directly, my hand pressed to the glass, fingers trembling. I couldn't help it. I had to get closer. I had to see. I took a step toward the window, slowly, cautiously. The street outside was quiet, as though the whole world had stopped for a moment. The distant sounds of traffic, the occasional clink of a bottle breaking, everything was gone. Only the faint flickering from across the street remained, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. And then, just as I reached out to pull back the curtain and look once more, I saw it. There, behind the glass of the apartment window, was me. For a split second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. My reflection stared back at me, as though I were looking at myself from across the street. But then I realized, no, this wasn't my reflection. It was wrong. The angle was off, the way my hands moved was strange, like I wasn't controlling them. The figure in the window, my double, wasn't me at all. It was watching me. The figure, my reflection, my other self, smiled. And for the first time, I truly felt it. The cold, the dread, creeping under my skin. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong from the very start. And it was getting closer. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest. What did it want? How had it gotten there? And why had it been watching me all this time? I had to leave the apartment. I had to get away, but I couldn't look away. The figure in the window, my reflection, still stood there, motionless, its cold smile stretched across its face. And then, just as I was about to turn away and run, the light in the window went out. And I heard a sound. A low, soft sound, like a whisper, so quiet that I almost missed it. It was coming from behind me. I didn't turn around. Not yet. The whisper lingered in the air, like a breath caught in time, too soft to make sense of but too close to ignore. My entire body stiffened, every muscle tensed as though I were caught in some kind of trap. I forced myself to breathe, but the air felt thick, heavier than it should have been, and for a moment, I couldn't tell whether the whisper had been real or just a figment of my panic-stricken mind. I dared not turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee from whatever presence had settled in the shadows behind me, but I couldn't move. It was as though the apartment itself had locked me in place. The figure in the window had vanished. The flickering light was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness that gnawed at my senses. But that whisper, that sound, still clung to the edges of my thoughts. I took a cautious step back, still facing the window, my eyes darting around the room. The apartment felt foreign to me now, as if the walls were closing in. The corners of the room seemed darker than they should be, and the usual hum of the city had faded away into an unsettling silence. I shook my head. It was just my nerves. The stress of moving into a new place, adjusting to a new environment. Nothing more. But even as I told myself this, the unease didn't fade. In fact, it only grew stronger, creeping under my skin and tightening my chest. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see nothing but the empty room behind me. But the instant I looked away from the window, I felt it, the presence. The air had shifted. The space behind me felt wrong. My eyes snapped back to the window, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, someone, standing there again. But the moment I blinked, it was gone. The window was empty. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't be alone with this feeling, with the growing certainty that I wasn't alone in the apartment, even though there was no one physically there. I turned toward the door, my hand reaching for the handle, but the whisper returned, louder this time, clearer. "Stay," it breathed, and my body froze once again. The voice was thin, barely audible, but it was there, as clear as if someone had whispered directly into my ear. I spun around, panic flooding my veins. There was nothing. Just the shadows creeping along the walls, the dim lights from the street casting long, distorted shapes through the window. But it wasn't enough. The air was suffocating. The silence was suffocating. The apartment suddenly felt too small. Too close. I had to leave. I yanked open the door and stepped into the hallway, desperate to escape the strange, oppressive atmosphere of my apartment. But as I walked toward the elevator, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that the very walls of the building were pressing in on me. I pressed the button for the elevator, tapping my foot nervously. The seconds stretched on, dragging in the silence, until finally the door slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby, but the moment the doors closed, I heard it again. A whisper. Not from behind, but from somewhere inside the elevator itself. "Look up." I didn't want to look. I didn't want to acknowledge it. But the voice was so insistent, so pervasive, that I couldn't help it. Slowly, my gaze lifted to the ceiling of the elevator. At first, I saw nothing. Just the dull, fluorescent light flickering above. But then, as my eyes focused, I saw it. A small crack in the ceiling. Barely noticeable, just a thin line, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. And yet, it was there now, widening slowly as if something was pressing against the other side. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed myself against the corner of the elevator, my eyes glued to the crack. It seemed to grow larger with each passing second, the darkness beyond it expanding, like something was trying to push through. I reached for the emergency button, but before I could press it, The elevator lurched, the lights flickering violently before plunging the entire space into complete darkness. I felt the floor beneath me shift, as if the elevator were tilting, descending, but not in any direction it should have. I heard the softest sound, like footsteps, coming closer, closer with each passing moment. I couldn't see, couldn't move, and all I could do was hold my breath, waiting for the inevitable. And then, the light snapped back on. The elevator doors opened, and I was no longer in the building. I stood in a dark, empty street, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows around me. The city was silent, eerily so, and the buildings loomed like empty shells, their windows dark and vacant. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stepped forward, my mind racing. How had I gotten here? What had happened to the elevator? As I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, I saw it. Across the street, there was a window, lit with that same soft, yellowish glow. And the figure. My figure. Watching. Waiting. But this time, I didn't feel drawn to it. I didn't feel the pull of curiosity or the strange compulsion to look. This time, I felt something else. Something darker. I had to leave. I had to get away before the shadows caught me, before the whispers became too loud to ignore. But as I turned to run, I heard one final whisper, soft, almost soothing in its tone. You'll never escape. And in that moment, I understood. The apartment wasn't the prison. The city wasn't the trap. It was me. And no matter how far I ran, I was always going to be drawn back to that window, to that reflection, to that thing that watched me. Always. The street around me was deserted, but it felt alive. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace, it was the kind of silence that felt thick, suffocating. I stood frozen, looking over my shoulder at the window across the street. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like stone, rooted to the pavement by some invisible force. The reflection was still there, unmoving, its eyes staring straight at me. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. But no, there was no mistaking the way it watched. The figure in the window mirrored my every movement, perfectly synchronized, as if it were waiting for me to make the next move. But it wasn't me in the window. I knew that now. It was something else. Something darker. My breath quickened, and I tried to step back, but the ground felt unsteady beneath me. My vision blurred, and I had the distinct feeling that the world around me was bending, shifting, pulling me toward that window, toward that reflection. I shook my head, trying to break free from the trance that was taking hold of me. This is just in your head. You're fine. It's not real. But the voice, that voice, echoed in my mind again. You'll never escape. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching for anything to steady myself. The cold pavement beneath my fingers was rough and unfamiliar. The air smelled stale, like a forgotten corner of the city, and the streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally long. I forced myself to look away from the reflection, focusing on the street in front of me, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that gnawed at my insides. I needed to leave. I had to get out of there. But every step I took, the further I felt from any kind of safety. The reflection still watched. It followed my every move. I reached the edge of the street, where a dark alley stretched out before me. The buildings on either side towered over me, their windows vacant and empty, just like the apartment. The feeling of isolation was suffocating, the weight of something watching me from every direction unbearable. but I couldn't go back to the apartment. Not now. Not with that reflection still haunting me. I turned down the alley, hoping the darkness would offer some kind of respite. It was cold here, colder than the street, and the air felt damp against my skin. My footsteps echoed in the silence, a constant reminder that I was completely alone. Or so I thought. As I walked deeper into the alley, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. Something had been following me since I left the apartment. I turned around, my heart racing. Nothing. No one. But the alleyway seemed off. The shadows were too thick, the darkness too heavy, like it was pulling me in. I could feel the presence again, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Then, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the darkness. I whipped around, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. The alley was closing in on me. The buildings felt too tall, too imposing, as if they were leaning in, suffocating me with their sheer presence. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The reflection. It was standing at the end of the alley, its face indistinguishable from my own. But there was something wrong about it. Its eyes were darker, hollow, and its lips twisted into a grin that wasn't mine. The reflection didn't just mirror me anymore. It mocked me. I tried to move, but my legs refused to obey. My body felt like lead, anchored to the spot. The reflection was getting closer now, its grin widening with each step. And as it drew nearer, the footsteps behind me grew louder, more frantic, as if something or someone was catching up. I could hear it. Feel it. The presence was so close now, I could practically hear its breath. I had no choice but to look away from the reflection, but the moment I did, the footsteps stopped. I didn't dare turn around. Forcing myself to take one slow step forward, I tried to calm my breathing, tried to think clearly. Just get to the end of the alley. Find a street, anything. Get out of this nightmare. I quickened my pace, but the moment I moved faster, the sound of the footsteps returned, closer now, more insistent. Look at me. The voice came again. It was low, drawn out, like a whisper that brushed against my skin. It wasn't the voice from the apartment this time, but something more familiar. Something that made my blood run cold. It was my voice. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to turn around. I had to see what was behind me. But I couldn't. I couldn't face whatever was following me. I had to run. I had to. The alley bent. The walls shifted, stretching outward, elongating, until it felt like I was running through a maze. The more I ran, the further away the exit seemed to get. The darkness grew deeper, pressing in on all sides, and the footsteps were relentless. I was lost. The reflection was lost. The alley was a never-ending loop, and I was trapped in it. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. Not when I heard my own voice calling me from the darkness. And when I finally reached the end of the alley, there was no street. No light. Just the cold, empty reflection of the alley mirrored perfectly in a window I didn't remember seeing before. And I could see myself in it. But it wasn't me. Not anymore. I stood frozen before the window, my reflection staring back at me. But it wasn't me. At least, not anymore. The figure in the glass had a look in its eyes that I didn't recognize. It wasn't fear or confusion, it was something darker, something colder. It was a look of knowing, a look of someone who had already seen the end. I tried to take a step back, but my body refused to move. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. The reflection, the other me, smiled. The grin twisted unnaturally, stretching wider, its eyes gleaming with an almost predatory delight. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath shallow, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't look away. The figure in the window moved its hand, and I mirrored its every motion, my own hand lifting as if it was being controlled. A terrible thought flashed through my mind. Is this how it starts? Then, without warning, the window started to distort. The glass rippled like water, warping their reflection, bending the figure in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It stretched and warped, like something was pushing through from the other side. I took a step back, stumbling, my hands reaching for anything to steady myself. The alley around me was closing and everything was tightening, suffocating me. The very air felt thick, as if the space itself was being reshaped by the thing in the window. Suddenly, the figure in the window stopped moving. Its grin disappeared. Its eyes narrowed, locking with mine. And for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought it was looking through me, like it could see straight into my soul. Then, with a jolt, I was pulled forward, my body moving against my will, drawn to the window as if it had a magnetic force. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My mouth was frozen open, my throat tight, as if something was closing around it. The ground beneath me vanished. I fell forward, into the darkness, into the reflection. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the alley. I was in a room that looked identical to the one I had fled from. It was dark, cold, and empty, but there was a heavy sense of familiarity hanging in the air, like I had been here before. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. There was a door on the far side of the room. I knew I had to leave, but when I tried to move toward it, my legs wouldn't obey. It felt like I was walking through molasses, every step slow and laborious. The door was closed now. So close. My hands reached out, trembling, and gripped the cold metal handle. It wouldn't turn. I pulled harder, panic crawling up my spine. The door was locked. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed. Behind me, I could hear the faintest sound. It was low at first, like a whisper, but then it grew louder. It sounded like breathing. Deep, uneven, like something was just behind me, waiting. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The room was still empty. But something wasn't right. The shadows were moving. They weren't just flickering from the dim light, they were shifting, crawling along the walls like they had a life of their own. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and I could feel the temperature drop, the air thickening with each passing second. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, near the window, a figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally so, its features hidden in shadow. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its eyes locked onto mine. I took a step back, my mind racing. Was this it? Was this what had been following me? The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. The air seemed to ripple as it approached, the temperature dropping with every inch it closed between us. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was paralyzed. And then, in the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure's reflection was in the window. But it was different. alive. It raised its hand, just like I had done earlier, and I felt my own hand rise in response. It wasn't me anymore. My body had become a puppet. The figure in the reflection mirrored my every movement, but it did it with a kind of twisted, malicious intent. Its smile returned, stretching wider, as if it was savoring my every reaction. I screamed, but no sound escaped my mouth. The reflection wasn't just mimicking me. It was controlling me. The figure in the room was getting closer now, its footfalls silent on the cold floor. I could see the outline of its face, eyes too dark to make out, a mouth twisted into a permanent grin. I could feel its gaze on me, and every fiber of my being screamed to break free, but I was powerless. My hand reached for the window, but it wasn't a reflection anymore. The glass was cold beneath my fingers, solid. And then, the figure stepped through the window. It didn't shatter. It didn't break. It just passed through like it was walking into another world. And then, it was right behind me. I felt its breath on the back of my neck, a cold rush that froze me to the bone. The door was still sealed. But the reflection, it was no longer a reflection. It was standing in the doorway, grinning, waiting, watching. I could feel my heart thudding painfully in my chest, but the sound of it seemed distant, muffled, like it was happening to someone else. The air around me grew thick with tension, my breath shallow as the figure behind me loomed closer. Its presence pressed in on me from all sides, suffocating, pressing down on me like the walls themselves were closing in. I dared not turn around. The reflection, the thing in the doorway, it was too close now. The mirror no longer showed my own terrified face. Instead, it was that twisted version of myself, smiling cruelly, watching me as if I were nothing more than a plaything. The reflection in the window, it wasn't a reflection anymore. It had crossed over. It was real. And it was me, but not me. I could feel my mind shattering with the impossible reality of it all. I was standing in the same room as something that wasn't human. Something that had no right to be there. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but my voice betrayed me. No sound came from my throat. No escape. No refuge. The figure in the doorway, my reflection, moved closer, its eyes never leaving mine. Its smile grew, stretching wider, until its mouth was too large for its face, like it was devouring its own features. What is it? What does it want from me? I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. Every time I attempted to take a step, my feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. I felt cold, trapped, as though my very presence was part of some dark ritual I hadn't been invited to. And then, the reflection's grin twisted even further, its eyes narrowing in satisfaction. It knows. Suddenly, the air shifted. The temperature in the room plummeted, a chill that seeped into my bones, making my teeth chatter. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched toward me, moving with a mind of their own. They weren't natural, they were alive. With a violent jolt, I felt my body move. It wasn't me, it was the reflection, controlling me. My arms jerked forward, my hands pressed against the cold, glass window. And for a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure, standing just behind me. But it wasn't me. It wasn't me at all. I spun around, my heart in my throat. But when I did, I found myself face to face with nothing. No reflection in the glass. Just empty space. But I knew. I knew the thing was there, hiding, watching from behind the darkness, just waiting for me to make a mistake. The air felt thicker now, harder to breathe. My chest tightened, my thoughts scrambled. I needed to get out. I had to get out of here. But the door was still sealed. The window was still too far to reach. It was then that I noticed it. The walls, they were changing. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist. But now, the very structure of the room was shifting. The wallpaper peeled away in slow, deliberate motions, revealing cracks in the walls. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, as if the house itself was groaning under some terrible weight. A loud bang echoed in the room, and I spun around again, my eyes wide with panic. It was the window. The thing behind me had struck it, smashing against it like an invisible fist. The glass rippled like water, distorting everything in its path, and I felt this sudden pull, like the room itself was trying to drag me in. I staggered back, my breath ragged, stumbling over the shifting floor. The room was closing in around me. The walls weren't just moving, they were alive. The house was alive, and it was hungry. I need to escape. I need to break free. I turned back toward the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle once more. It wouldn't budge. It was locked, sealed shut, as if the house was trying to keep me here forever. I could hear the low hum in the air now, a sound that vibrated through my chest and into my bones, like something terrible was about to happen. I could feel the presence behind me, and I knew it was getting closer. It was right there, in the shadows, waiting to consume me, to drag me down into whatever dark place it came from. And then, the window shattered. The glass exploded outward, and I was thrown backward, landing hard on the floor. My head spun, blood rushing in my ears. I gasped for air, my hands trembling, trying to push myself up. But it wasn't over. The thing that had been watching me was here now. And it wasn't content with just staring through the window anymore. It was inside. I looked up, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw it, the reflection, standing right in front of me, its twisted grin wide and hungry. The other version of me. The thing that had been controlling me, watching me, manipulating me. It reached out, its cold fingers brushing my face. Its eyes gleamed with malice, and I knew, with horrifying certainty, that this was the end. But then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The smile faded, and its grip loosened. I didn't understand. The door. It was opening. But not for me. It was opening for it. The room around me vanished. The walls crumbled away into nothingness, and I was left alone in the blackness. The figure stepped into the darkness, the door slamming shut behind it. And just like that, it was gone. The house was silent. The air was still. I was alone. But I knew one thing. It wasn't over. The window that had been watching me, it was still there. And I was still trapped. But now, I had seen what was on the other side. And it was coming for me. Have you ever been sure of something, only to realize it was nothing at all? That feeling of absolute certainty, followed by a creeping unease, when you know something is wrong but can't quite explain why? It started one night, with a sound. It was subtle at first, just a soft rustle, almost like a piece of paper being moved. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe the house settling. But then I heard it again, a small scrape, like something was dragging across the floor. I pulled the blankets up around me, trying to ignore it. But the sound kept coming, soft but distinct, like something, or someone was in my room. I lay still, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing. There was nothing in my room except for the familiar walls and my closet, which had been shut all evening. I had checked before going to bed, making sure everything was in place, everything was safe. Still, the sound persisted. It was coming from the closet. It wasn't a loud noise, not at first, but it was persistent. There was a rustling, followed by a faint tapping. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, the sound came again, louder this time, something shifting inside the closet. I felt the air grow heavier, colder, and I realized something was terribly wrong. I couldn't just lie there and ignore it anymore. Slowly, I turned my head towards the closet door, watching it as if expecting it to move on its own. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the dead of night. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was in there, waiting. Finally, I could stand it no longer. I pushed the covers off and swung my feet onto the cold floor. The wood creaked under my weight as I stood up, my pulse racing, my breath shallow. My eyes locked on the closet door. I reached out, hands trembling, and grasped the handle. The moment I touched it, a chill ran up my spine. The closet door opened with a soft squeak, and I froze. The inside was empty. Nothing was there. No shadows, no movement. Just the familiar clothes hanging inside, and the shelves filled with old boxes. I exhaled slowly, feeling foolish for letting my mind get the better of me. But as I was about to close the door, something stopped me. There, on the floor, just in front of the closet, was a small trail of dust, disturbed in a way that wasn't normal. It was as if something had been dragged across the floor, leaving no trace of its origin. My heart skipped a beat. I bent down to get a closer look, my breath caught in my throat. The trail led right to the back of the closet, where it disappeared into the shadows. For a moment, I just stared at it, unsure of what to think. And then, I heard it. A breath. Soft, almost imperceptible, but there. It was coming from the closet. I pulled back in terror, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. My pulse raced, and I felt the cold sweat begin to trickle down my spine. I was frozen, unable to move, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. I couldn't see anything. There was no one in the closet. No sound except for the faint breath, barely audible, but undeniably there. Suddenly, the air grew thicker, heavier. The sound of the breath became clearer, louder, more deliberate. It was as if whatever was in there was waiting for me to do something. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my body betraying me as I stood there, paralyzed by the terror that gripped my chest. And then, just when I thought I could take no more, the breath stopped. The closet door slammed shut. I jumped back, my heart racing, my mind spinning. The room was silent again. I didn't dare open the closet door this time. I couldn't. Something was there. Something had been waiting for me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat up in bed, staring at the closet door, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But the rest of the night passed without incident. Or so I thought. The next night, when I finally managed to fall asleep, I woke up to the same rustling sound. Only this time, it was louder. The air in the room felt colder, thicker, almost suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly opened my eyes. I saw it then, the closet door cracked open just a sliver, as if something had been waiting for me to wake up. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My body was frozen in place as I waited, listening. Then, in the silence of the room, a whisper. Soft, almost inaudible, but clear as day. It spoke my name. My heart stopped. The voice, if it could even be called a voice, was cold and empty. It lingered in the air, vibrating the space between us, but it didn't sound human. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was my name, spoken with a chilling finality. James. I froze. The room felt colder now, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. The whisper hung there, suspended in the air, as if waiting for me to respond, to do something, anything. I couldn't. I just couldn't. I had to get up, had to leave, but my limbs refused to obey. My mind raced, my pulse pounding in my ears, yet I was still lying there, staring at the closet door. It was cracked open a fraction, just enough for something to be lurking behind it. A cold, nauseating dread washed over me. It wasn't normal. It couldn't be. The house had been quiet for weeks. This feeling had come out of nowhere, and it was starting to feel like it was going to stay. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, ever so slowly, I turned my head toward the closet. The gap in the door seemed to widen just a little more, as though something had moved inside. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it almost impossible to breathe. James, the whisper again, closer this time. Louder. Almost like it was right next to me. My eyes widened. I could hear the faint rustling of fabric, like something was moving, shifting inside the closet. But there was nothing there, nothing visible. My hand reached out instinctively to the lamp beside my bed, the switch slipping under my fingers as I tried to turn it on. The light flickered, buzzed, then went out entirely. My heart raced as the room was plunged into darkness. And then it happened. The closet door slammed open. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. I gasped and bolted upright, my body shaking uncontrollably. The gap in the door stretched wider now, and in the darkness, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark blur against the blackness of the closet. But then, I saw something else. Something that shouldn't have been there, someone, a figure, standing in the doorway, facing me. But the face wasn't right. It was a mask of darkness, hollowed out, as though the figure's face had been erased entirely. There was only emptiness, a void, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I couldn't look away. I should have screamed, should have run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. And then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, its movement unnatural, like it was gliding rather than walking. James, the whisper again, this time from inside my mind. I was certain my heart was about to explode. Every instinct in me screamed to get out of that room, to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor, my body frozen in place. The figure stopped in the middle of the room, just a few feet from my bed. It tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. I could hear the faint sound of its breath, shallow and raspy, like it had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. And then, just when I thought I might lose my mind from the terror, it did something even worse. It smiled. The smile wasn't a smile at all. It was a grotesque distortion of something human, stretching impossibly wide, too wide. The darkness around its mouth deepened, as if there was nothing but an endless abyss behind its teeth. It didn't move, not immediately, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating the air around me. And then, with a sudden jolt, it spoke. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" The words slithered through my mind, each one more horrifying than the last. The voice wasn't coming from the figure. No, it was inside my head, like it was part of me, speaking directly into my thoughts. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing, whatever it was, had been in the closet before. It had been waiting for me, watching me. It had been watching for a long time. I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body refused to listen. I don't know how much time passed, but the thing remained there, standing motionless, grinning that horrible grin. Then, as if it had decided to finish its work, it began to move closer. I finally found my voice. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head to the side, considering the question for a long moment. It opened its mouth again, but the words that came out weren't for me, they were for something else. "Not yet," it whispered. Not yet. I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get out, had to escape before whatever this was, took me. And with one final, desperate cry, I bolted out of the bed, toward the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted out of my room and down the hallway, the sound of the figure's raspy breath following me, echoing through the empty house. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house, standing in the cool night air, trembling with fear. But as I looked back at the house, I realized something far worse. The door to my bedroom was wide open. And the closet? It was empty. But only for now. The cold night air bit at my skin as I stood outside, staring at the house. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the only light coming from the distant street lamp flickering faintly. I didn't know how long I had been standing there, minutes, hours, it didn't matter. The fear still gripped me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the house was waiting for me to return. I couldn't go back inside. Not after what I'd seen. Not after what had been in that closet. But as I stood there, I realized there was nowhere else to go. I didn't have anyone I could call, not really. Friends? Family? No, they would never understand. They wouldn't believe me. I glanced toward the house again. The windows were dark, but something about the house felt alive. It felt aware of me, like it knew I was standing there, hesitating, wondering what to do. I didn't want to go back in, but I knew I had to. I had to face whatever was in there, whatever had been whispering my name in the dark. Reluctantly, I turned and walked back toward the door, my steps slow and heavy. The sound of my feet crunching the gravel echoed in the stillness, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, every creak of the house sounded too loud, too deliberate. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The house felt colder than it had before. The air was thick, heavy with the sense that something was waiting for me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The hallway was still dimly lit, the same as before. Nothing had changed, nothing except for the dread that weighed down on me. I reached the stairs, my hand gripping the railing tightly as I ascended. Every step felt like an eternity, each creak of the wood beneath my feet sounding too loud, too close. I kept my eyes on the hallway ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me, following me, watching. At the top of the stairs, I stood still for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared down the hallway toward my bedroom. The door was still open. The closet was still there. I wanted to turn back, but I knew I couldn't. I had to face it. Taking a deep breath, I moved toward the door. Each step seemed to get heavier, my feet sinking deeper into the floorboards as though the house was trying to pull me down into it. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was exactly as I had left it, but something was different. The air felt thick, as if it were filled with something unspeakable. The darkness in the corners seemed deeper, more oppressive, and I could hear the faintest sound, like breathing. It was coming from the closet. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch, but the light flickered again, dimming and buzzing before it went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness once more. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. I could feel the presence in the room, closing in on me. The closet door slowly creaked open. I didn't move. I couldn't. The whisper started again, low and breathy, coming from the dark corner. James. I shuddered, my blood turning to ice. It was so close, so real. The voice wasn't from behind the door or in the room, it was inside my head, curling around my thoughts. And then I heard it, a soft shuffle. Something moved inside the closet. I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen in place. A figure stepped out from the darkness of the closet. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was something solid, something that moved. It was tall and gaunt, its face still hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, suffocating me. It took a step forward. I could hear its breath, shallow and wet, like it was suffocating. James, it whispered again, closer now. I could feel its breath on my skin. I stepped back, my heart racing, but I couldn't look away. It was like my body was paralyzed, my mind caught in a web of terror. The figure tilted its head, slowly, deliberately, as if trying to understand me, trying to figure me out. "You've been waiting for me," it said again, but this time its voice was different. It was cold, almost cruel, like it had been expecting me. And then, without warning, it lunged at me. I stumbled backward, crashing into the bed as I tried to escape. The thing was on me in an instant, its hands, cold and clammy, gripping my arms, pulling me closer to its gaping mouth. I could feel its breath on my face, feel its body pressing against me. I had to get away. I had to survive. With every ounce of strength I had left, I shoved it away from me. It staggered back, momentarily losing its grip on me. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I bolted toward the door. The figure was right behind me, its raspy breath growing louder, closer. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled out into the hallway, my mind screaming for escape. But the hallway was empty. The house was silent. I turned back, my breath coming in gasps, expecting to see the figure right behind me. But there was nothing. The door to my bedroom slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I was alive. For now. But I knew one thing, it wasn't over. The guest in my closet had returned, and it wasn't going to leave. I spent the next few days in a daze, too terrified to go near the closet, too afraid to even look at the door to my bedroom. It felt like the house itself had changed, each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind outside, made me feel like I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a nightmare, that I had imagined the figure in the closet. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The whispers still echoed in my mind, growing louder with every passing hour. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, its hollow eyes staring at me, its breath hot and foul on my neck. It was waiting for me. It was always waiting. One night, when the air was thick and heavy, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront whatever it was, whatever had been haunting me. I had no choice. I had to end it, or it would never stop. With trembling hands, I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and made my way to the door. The house was eerily quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what would happen when I opened that door. But I knew I had to do it. The figure in the closet had been toying with me for too long. It had whispered my name, it had stalked me in the dark, and now it was time to face it. I took a deep breath, my fingers gripping the doorknob. The door felt unnaturally cold under my touch, and for a moment I hesitated. But then, with a sudden surge of determination, I threw it open. The room was just as I had left it. The bed was made, the floor was clean, and the closet door stood ajar, as though inviting me in. But there was no figure. No shadows creeping in the corners. For a split second, I thought maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it all. Maybe the fear had clouded my mind, twisting reality into something monstrous. But then I heard it. The soft shuffle of feet. It was coming from inside the closet. I turned toward it, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound grew louder, closer. I stepped forward, my breath shallow and uneven, my heart hammering in my chest. I shone the flashlight inside the closet. Nothing. The closet was empty. I stepped closer, my mind racing. I couldn't make sense of it. Where was the thing that had been there before? Where had it gone? I reached for the light switch on the wall to turn on the overhead light. The room flickered once, twice, and then the light buzzed and went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness once more. I froze. The shuffle started again. This time, it was louder, closer. I could feel it, hear it, as though it was right behind me. And then, from the darkness of the closet, came a whisper. James. It was my name. Soft, rasping, and full of malice. The breath was so close, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. But somehow, I knew that whatever was behind me, whatever had whispered my name, wasn't human. And then, the closet door slammed shut with an ear-splitting bang. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The air was thick, suffocating. I could hear something, heavy breathing, labored and wet. I stepped back, my pulse racing as I stared at the door. But then the whispers started again. They were louder now, all around me, as if the walls themselves were whispering my name. I turned toward the door. James. It was different this time. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice, low, guttural, and filled with something indescribable. The door to the closet creaked open, inch by inch, as though whatever was inside was slowly making its way out. I backed away, my legs trembling, my breath coming in short gasps. The door opened fully, and I saw it. The figure stood in the doorway of the closet, its face obscured by shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The figure moved forward, its footsteps slow and deliberate, the air growing colder with every step. "James," it whispered again, the voice almost mocking now. I stumbled back, my mind screaming for me to escape, but I couldn't. I was trapped, pinned to the spot by fear. The figure reached out, its hand, long and thin, coming toward me. I could see the fingers now, twisted and unnatural. I stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. And then, as if everything snapped into place, I realized the truth. It wasn't just in the closet. It had always been here. In the shadows. In the walls. Waiting. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's eyes, filled with a darkness so deep that it seemed to swallow everything around me. I never woke up. The house remained empty and silent, its secrets still locked away in the closet. And the guest? The one that whispered my name? It stayed there, waiting for the next person to open that door. Because it never leaves. It never has. Have you ever felt the strange sensation that something in your house doesn't quite belong? Or worse yet, that something hidden is waiting to be discovered? It's not just a feeling, not a passing thought, it's a reality. One you might not be ready for. I didn't know it then, but my discovery would change everything. It was supposed to be a simple renovation, just fixing up an old house. New paint, replacing old wood, adding a few touches here and there. But then, I found something unusual. I was in the attic, organizing some of the clutter that had accumulated over the years. Among the old furniture, dusty boxes, and discarded trinkets, there it was. A ladder. It wasn't a typical step ladder or anything that belonged in the attic. It was an old wooden ladder, the kind that seemed too out of place to be a functional part of the house. I stared at it for a long moment. There was no sign of where it had come from, no reason for it to be there. Its weathered wood looked almost too ancient, as though it had been hidden away for decades. The strange thing was, it led to a hatch in the ceiling, one that I had never noticed before. I've been in that attic 100 times, and I was sure that hatch wasn't there when I moved in. Curiosity pushed me to climb the ladder. It creaked and groaned with each step, but I didn't think much of it. It felt wrong, like the ladder didn't belong to this world, but I couldn't shake the urge to keep going. The higher I climbed, the more unsettling the atmosphere became, the air thick with dust and the faintest scent of something I couldn't quite place. When I finally reached the top and pushed the hatch open, I saw something that shouldn't have existed in my home or room. It wasn't just any room. It wasn't part of the house, at least not any part one had ever seen or heard about. The walls were bare, the floor covered with a thin layer of dust. A single, old wooden table stood in the center, and on that table was a large, cracked mirror. The room felt empty, yet filled with something unexplainable. It was as if time stood still in that room. The air was heavier, colder, and the silence almost deafening. But then, I heard it. At first, it was soft, a whisper, so faint I thought I imagined it. But then it became clearer. Laughter. High-pitched, childlike laughter echoing through the space. It wasn't coming from any direction, but from everywhere at once. And then, a voice. "Come play with us." I froze, unable to move. My body was screaming for me to leave, but my mind was too curious, too drawn to the room. Something was pulling me in. I should have turned back. I should have closed the hatch and never looked back. But instead, I walked into that room. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the door behind me slammed shut and the laughter grew louder. Closer. I looked into the mirror on the table. At first, all I saw was myself. But then something shifted. Something moved behind me, and the reflection in the glass was no longer mine. I wasn't alone. The figure behind me was a pale, distorted version of a person, their face blurry, but unmistakably there. And then they whispered my name. "Come play with us." I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. No one. Just the cold, empty room. But the voices didn't stop. They whispered, they laughed, they called to me, as if the room itself was alive with its own dark energy. And now was when I realized I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't supposed to find that ladder or open that hatch. The room wasn't part of the house, it was something else entirely. Something ancient. Something trapped. It didn't want me to leave. The more I stared at the mirror, the more I felt the air in the room grow heavy, thick with an oppressive presence. The whispers grew louder. The laughter grew more frantic. I could hear footsteps now, faint but unmistakable, as if something was moving toward me. I had to get out. I had to leave. I turned, desperate to find the ladder again, but as I made my way back to the hatch, I realized with horror that the ladder was gone. It had disappeared, leaving no trace. The room was changing. And now was when I realized the true horror of it all. The room wasn't just a place. It was a doorway. A doorway to somewhere else, somewhere far darker than I could ever understand. And the ladder? It wasn't just a ladder. It was the only way out. But now it was gone. The laughter continued to echo in my mind, and the mirror, the reflection, stared back at me with eyes that weren't mine. I never wanted to open that hatch again. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't the last time I'd hear the whispers. And it wasn't the last time I'd be pulled back into that room. Some doors, once opened, never truly close. The room and the voices within would wait. Always. After that night, everything changed. The house no longer felt like a home, it felt like a prison. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the eerie voice, the whispers, and the laughter I had heard were just a figment of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen and felt in that room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The following day, I tried to carry on as normal. I went to work, I did the dishes, I even tried to patch up a few cracks in the walls, but every time I walked past the attic stairs, my stomach twisted. The memory of the ladder in the room would not leave me. That evening, I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, staring up at the darkened entrance. The house creaked around me, the familiar sounds of settling would only making me more uneasy. I knew that I shouldn't go back up there. I knew I shouldn't investigate any further, but I couldn't help it. I had to know what was happening. With every step I climbed, my heart raced. The ladder felt heavier beneath my feet as if it was pulling me into the darkness. I reached the top and stared at the hatch, the same one I had opened the night before. It looked so ordinary now, as though it had always been there. The air was thick with dust, the room just beyond still hidden. But I had to know. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the latch, and then I pushed it open. The same cold air rushed down at me, the same silence surrounding me. I could feel it, the presence in the room, just waiting. But this time, there was something different. There was no laughter, no voices calling my name. Just a deafening silence that wrapped around me like a thick, suffocating blanket. I stepped into the room again, but nothing had changed. The table with the cracked mirror still stood in the center, and the room remained as empty as it had been the night before. It was as though it was frozen in time, untouched by anything outside. I approached the mirror, my own reflection staring back at me. The silence felt unbearable, pressing on me from every side. And then, I heard it. A faint tapping, coming from somewhere in the room. It was soft at first, like a finger gently tapping on the table, but then it grew louder. I spun around, but there was nothing. The room remained still, untouched. The tapping continued, each tap echoing louder, more urgent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I searched the room with frantic eyes, but there was no one there. And then the tapping stopped. But something had changed. The air felt thicker, heavier. And I could swear the shadows in the corners of the room were moving, creeping toward me. I tried to leave, but the hatch, the entrance to the attic, was no longer there. I backed up against the wall, my mind racing. The room had shifted, I was sure of it. I turned in every direction, looking for the exit, but there was no way out. The walls felt like they were closing in, the space growing smaller with every breath I took. The laughter started again. Soft at first, like a murmur just beyond my hearing, but it quickly grew louder until it filled the entire room. I could hear the faint sound of children's laughter echoing from all directions, and then a voice I knew all too well. "Come play with us." I froze. The voice, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, from the very air around me. I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty room. "Who are you?" But the laughter only grew louder, more insistent. "Come play with us," the voice repeated. I stumbled backward, tripping over the wooden table and crashing to the floor. My mind raced, and I tried to stand, but the room felt like it was spinning. The laughter became deafening, drowning out all rational thought. I was trapped. I had to get out. I had to leave. But there was no way out. The room wasn't just a room. It was something else. Something otherworldly, a place where the rules of time and space didn't seem to apply. And then I felt it. A cold breath against the back of my neck. The unmistakable feeling of something standing behind me. I turned, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing. No one. The room was still, silent once again. I rushed to the hatch, desperate to escape, and found it. This time, it was real, the ladder. It was back, just as I had seen it before. But as I grabbed the first rung, I heard a final whisper. "Come play with us." I didn't look back. I climbed down the ladder as quickly as I could, my heart racing. My mind was a blur of panic, my thoughts fractured by the sheer terror of what I had just experienced. I reached the bottom of the stairs and slammed the attic door shut behind me, breathing heavily. But even as I stood there, shaking, I could still hear it. The faintest echo of laughter, just beyond the reach of my hearing. The house was never the same after that. The room, the voices, the laughter, it all stayed with me. The door to the attic remained shut, but I knew it wasn't the last time I'd hear that voice. I had opened something I couldn't close. And whatever was waiting up there, in that room, would never let me forget it. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and fear. The house, once a place of comfort, had become a maze of tension and dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching me, lurking just beyond my line of sight. Even as I tried to go about my daily routines, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like a warning. I stayed away from the attic. The door remained locked, the space beyond it sealed off in my mind, but that didn't make the fear any less real. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the sound of children's laughter echoing in my ears. No matter how many times I checked the house, there was no explanation, no source. Just that same cold, empty feeling, like something was waiting for me in the dark corners of the house. One evening, after a long day at work, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the hallway. My reflection stared back at me, tired, eyes red from lack of sleep. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But then the air shifted. I couldn't explain it. It was like the space around me had suddenly thickened, as if the atmosphere itself had changed. I felt a pressure against my chest, as though something invisible was pushing down on me. The silence in the house was suffocating, oppressive. I turned away from the mirror, trying to shake the feeling, but the air seemed to follow me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear it again, faint whispers. They were coming from somewhere in the house, low and unintelligible, but unmistakably there. It wasn't just the attic anymore. It was everywhere. I paced through the rooms, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty house. The whispers grew louder as I moved, leading me toward the living room. As I passed the hallway, I froze. The door to the attic stood ajar. The door had been locked. I approached it cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a brief moment, I considered turning away. I wanted to leave, to run, but something drew me closer. The whispers were stronger now, almost frantic, as though they were urging me to enter. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The ladder was there, waiting for me. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just an ordinary ladder leading to an attic. It was a bridge to something far darker, something far more dangerous. I hesitated. My mind screamed at me to turn around, but my feet moved before I could stop them. Slowly, I climbed the ladder, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder as I ascended, and I could feel the darkness creeping up behind me, pressing against my back. I reached the top and opened the hatch. The room beyond was just as I had left it, empty, silent, the table and mirror standing as though they were waiting for me. The room seemed untouched by time, as if it existed outside of it altogether. But then I heard the laughter again. This time, it wasn't faint. It wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the cold, empty room. The laughter stopped, but I could still feel the presence. I could feel something watching me, something that was not human, not of this world. My eyes darted to the mirror. At first, I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was reflected back at me. But my gaze was drawn to it, as if some invisible force was compelling me to look. I stared at my reflection, my tired, drawn face staring back at me. But then, something shifted. There, in the reflection, behind me, was a figure. It was a child. A little girl. Her face was pale, too pale, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. She stood in the corner of the room, her back to me, staring at the mirror. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my body refusing to obey. The girl's lips curled into a smile that seemed wrong, too wide, too unsettling. And then she whispered, "Come play with us." The words echoed in my ears, reverberating through the room, and for a moment I was lost in the sound. But the next thing I knew, the reflection of the girl in the mirror began to move. She turned, slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving mine. I watched as she walked toward the edge of the mirror, her footsteps soft, almost inaudible. And then she reached out, her small hand pressing against the glass. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out, but the ladder, the way back, was no longer there. The space that had once been my escape was now closed off, as though it had never existed. I was trapped. The girl in the mirror was no longer smiling. Her face was twisted into something dark, something sinister. And the whispers grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out all rational thought. "Come play with us," she repeated, her voice growing more demanding, more desperate. I wanted to fight, to resist, but I could feel it, the pull. The pull toward the mirror, toward the darkness beyond it. Something was waiting for me, something I couldn't see but could feel. I pushed myself up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and stumbled toward the hatch. The room seemed to shift around me, warping, twisting. I reached the top of the ladder, my fingers grasping the first rung, but as I tried to descend, the ladder began to fade. It wasn't real anymore. It was disappearing into nothing. The room was closing in. And then I heard it, a voice, familiar, echoing from the darkness. "It's too late." I screamed, but there was no sound. The house, the attic, the room, everything was gone. I was alone. Forever. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my own breath filled the room, harsh and fast, but the silence outside was suffocating. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. The room was familiar, the same walls, the same furniture, everything in its place. But something was wrong. The air felt different, thicker, as though it was holding its breath. I sat up, shaking, my hands trembling as I reached for the light switch. The harsh light flickered on, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, I thought I was still in that other world, the one with the mirror, the whispers, the girl. But this was real, wasn't it? I rubbed my eyes, trying to dispel the lingering feeling of dread. Was it all just a dream? Had I imagined everything? But then I heard it again. The laughter. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere deep within the house, echoing through the walls. I froze. This wasn't a dream. I stood up, my legs weak beneath me, and moved toward the door. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't escape it, not anymore. The whispers, the laughter, they were calling to me, urging me to return. I stepped into the hallway, the sound of my footsteps drowned by the eerie silence that hung in the air. The house felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked slowly toward the attic stairs. The door was closed, but I knew what awaited me behind it. The ladder. The room. The darkness. I hesitated. I didn't want to go back, but I couldn't ignore the pull. It was like something inside me was driving me forward, telling me that I had no choice but to face whatever awaited me up there. I reached for the door, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle. The laughter was louder now, closer, more insistent. I could feel the presence in the air, like fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I pushed the door open. The attic was waiting for me. But this time, something was different. The room was darker, more oppressive. The familiar sense of dread had intensified, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The mirror was still there, but this time it wasn't the only thing in the room. There were other things, shadows that seemed to move and twist in the corners, like creatures that couldn't exist in the light. The walls were alive with sound, whispers that crawled beneath my skin, pulling me in. And then I saw it. The ladder. It was still there, but now it seemed wrong. The rung stretched upward, disappearing into a dark void above. It wasn't just a way out anymore. It was an entrance, a gateway to something far worse than I could have ever imagined. I felt my chest tighten, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Come," they said. "Come with us." I wanted to turn back, to run away from this nightmare, but my body wouldn't move. It was like the room had trapped me, like I was no longer in control. The laughter grew, surrounding me, filling the space. And then, the mirror, it started to change. The surface rippled like water, distorting and bending as if something was trying to break through. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. I had to get out. I had to leave. But then the girl appeared. The same little girl from before. She stood in front of the mirror, her face pale, her eyes black as coal. She didn't smile this time. She just stared at me, her gaze empty, hollow. And then she spoke, her voice a whisper that echoed in my mind. "Come play with us." I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my pulse racing as I backed away from her, from the mirror, from everything. I turned and ran for the ladder, but the room had changed again. The walls seemed to close in on me, the space shrinking with every breath I took. I reached for the ladder, but it was no longer there. The room was gone. The laughter was deafening now, coming from everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. The walls were closing in, and I could feel something reaching out from the dark corners, pulling at me, tugging me into the void. I was no longer sure where I was. The attic, the house, the world, it all seemed to blur, merging into one overwhelming sensation of terror. And then I heard the voice again. The one I knew, the one that had been with me since the beginning. "You can't leave." I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the shadows, stretching and shifting in the corners, as if they were alive. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the room, as if the very air had absorbed it. I was trapped. And as I stood there, alone in the dark, the laughter started again. But this time, it wasn't just the voice of a child. It was a chorus, 1,000 voices echoing through the void, all calling to me, all demanding that I stay. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never leave. The room, the house, the very world I had known was gone. I was now a part of something else, something that could never be explained, never understood. Something far worse than anything I had ever imagined. And as the darkness consumed me, I heard one last whisper. "You're ours now." Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, Unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.